I want to pick up where we left off before moving on to other questions. I was asking about your role in researching, potential issues in terms of neurological syndromes. We know that there was what was at the time called the mystery neurological disease. We know that there have been people who never did get diagnoses. And all that to say, environmental causes were suspected. And I'm wondering if you could speak to your role in researching this issue, and is it ongoing?
I can certainly, I was Assistant Deputy Minister of Public Health and then Deputy Minister of Public Health while that work was ongoing. I can tell you in the early phases, it was more like random thoughts around what it could be. And it wasn't approaching it in in my limited knowledge as a pharmacist, but at least with a research background, that there's something more appropriate that would be followed. And so I asked the people of public health what would normally occur in such a situation. And so it was mapped out that there needed to be an epidemiological survey. There had to be a process of deduction and ensuring that there was evaluation both at the patient level but also at the environment level. And so that process was not put together by me, but it was a question I was asked because there were many hands in that pot, many people going in various directions, and there was not a systematic approach early on. And there were suspicions and suggestions and researchers from across Canada suggesting that they go off and do certain investigations without any kind of correlation or even potential causative relationship. And so we took a scientific approach, and that's the outcome from that work. Not work done by me, work done by the experts at the Department of Health and partners at both RHAs. And
so I would agree with the idea that research was needed. Was environmental testing done as part of this, process of deduction and looking at potential environmental causes, which were raised by public health experts who do this for a living?
Based on that epidemiological survey and the survey of all the, that was conducted with each of those individuals, there is a very lengthy questionnaire. Many experts fed into the types of questions that needed to be asked. Based on that survey, there was nothing that, from an environmental perspective, that suggested there was a causative situation there.
And what was the role of the Department of Environment? Because we know that public health was broken up and part of it went into Healthy Environments branch under Environment and Local Government. And you do have an environmental epidemiologist, and you do have staff that I understand were involved. And so I guess at some point was decided, no, we're not going to collect samples, we're not going to investigate the potential environmental causes.
So staff were asked about information that would be potentially contributory, but there hadn't been any types of blooms or anything that suggested during that time period that that occurred. So there was no information that group was able to provide at that time.
And so, looking at what the science is showing, and this is how science works, more information gets added, and there's increasingly a link between chronic exposure to BMAA, for example, to neurological problems. And so that chronic exposure is a key thing, because we do know from 2010 on that we're talking about algal blooms. And so I'm wondering why there wasn't environmental testing to eliminate that, that potential factor. And I guess I'm saying BMAA, I know that's not the only possible cause that could be coming from cyanobacteria, but it's one of the ones that's showing up in the scientific literature.
Again, I didn't conduct, and I don't have the results of that investigation in front of me, but to the best of my recollection, and this is information that is readily available and could be directed to the Department of Health, there is nothing out of that survey that suggested there was any correlation to consumption or whatever it might have been to suggest that further investigation in that area was needed. And I would put more weight on the clinical review conducted by 6 New Brunswick neurologists in relation to the patient data, and that I believe all but potentially 2 had other potential diagnoses or prior diagnoses.
And you were at the Department of Health at that time, so I would expect you would be able to speak to some of that. I will put that to the Department of Health. However, I'm trying to establish the role what I think should be part of the role of the piece of public health that ended up under environment, and whether that piece is doing its job when it comes to these issues. And so one of the key things that was in your presentation is even looking at preventative action, and I would urge, the precautionary principle as well, looking at preventative action in terms of, for example, having stronger regulations on preventing nutrients getting into the water to even minimize the risk of algal blooms, minimize the risk of cyanotoxins being present. And I do want to point out, water is not just used for recreational use. People eat things that come from the water, and it has downstream impacts even on marine environment. There's bioaccumulation. So can you speak to why there aren't stronger regulations to prevent nutrients getting into water, to prevent algal blooms?
So again, under the Clean Environment Act, there's very robust process requirements and approvals for industry or otherwise in terms of getting approval to operate. Similarly, construction or development within 30 meters of body of water, wetland, or our permitting requirements are in place. Again, you heard earlier, we work with CCME, and we're part of all of those subcommittees and work within the guidelines that are agreed upon and brought forward through that organization. And we also provide guidelines for example, for consumption of fish in relation to mercury, and that's coming from the Department of Health, but we are part of those providing that information.
Okay, and what are the regulations governing nitrogen and phosphorus going into waterways, runoff, things like that?
So again, kind of coming back to approvals to operate, there's clear discharge criteria that must be met.
For nitrogen and phosphorus?
That involve treatment of water, and that all, again, originates from the CCME and their guidance.
And what about for runoff situations?
So, I mean, it is a good question. However, non-point sources are very difficult to regulate.
And would contribute to this major problem of algal blooms that's increasing.
Again, it's multifactorial. It's hard and very difficult at times. There's no one single area one could point to. We've got temperature, we've got human activities, and even the geological makeup of certain areas of the province.
And especially because of the changing climate, because of the increase in temperature, it's even more important to make sure there's proper regulations for things like nitrogen and phosphorus. And in your presentation, you indicated that the most effective component of a long-term strategy for reducing the incidence of cyanobacterial blooms is to control the input of nutrients, specifically phosphorus and nitrogen, into the water body. So I guess I'm wondering, is that, it sounds like it's not being done except for in certain circumstances. Sounds like more needs to be done.
So I'll go back to something I mentioned earlier. The quality of our water is good. We've not seen changes historically. Up to we're still 80% of our measures have been within the good to excellent category, and that has remained stable. Certainly appreciate what you're saying, and I think that's part of a wider province-wide work that needs to occur. I think everybody has responsibility. Everybody has a role to play. And in terms of the educational opportunities that exist to help mitigate and prevent examples like nitrogen or phosphorus ending into our waterways is something that we all must look at, and look at the activities we need to change.
Okay, and I guess I would argue that the Department of Environment has a very specific and clear role to play in ensuring there's a set of good regulations and that they are enforced. I'm going to move on to something related to this in terms of water quality. In the plan, number 15 here, your update, develop a new approach to managing surface water quality on a watershed basis in light of the recommendations of the Working Group on Watershed Management. Could you please tell us how many watersheds are involved and how many plans have been created up to date? Please give us an update on that. Before lunch.
So, maybe I'll start with looking at the Shediac Watershed Plan, and that being a really great learning opportunity and platform to inform moving forward. But I would share that all watershed groups, organizations work on plans, and they were brought together last fall. And there are actions that we identified in terms of making sure there's consistent training and requirements that are shared so that we're all doing the same thing. And so again, going back to the Shediac Watershed Plan, we're using that as a stepping off place because there are lots of good practice and best practice that was learned from that experience.
Okay, so there's one in place right now. I'm going to pass this over to Mr. Coon for one quick question. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning. Action 10 of your watershed plan or water strategy is to introduce legislated requirements for local governments to publicly report drinking water quality monitoring results, and indicates on your progress report that after 5 years, halfway through the plan, work has not begun on this, is not started. My question is very simple. why are you not ensuring that New Brunswickers have the right to know what's in their drinking water?
And it may be that you weren't present for an earlier answer in relation to that. However, there's a couple of reasons around legislation. First, local government reform. That was something that needed to take place first. But we also, all data is fed into two portals that enable all New Brunswickers to look at this data. So it's open, transparent data.